In this video, I'm going to show you how to use one simple JavaScript function to enable any number of buttons to open any number of elements. So what we're going to end up with in the demonstration is this. If I click any button, I am opening a separate div that exists in my HTML already. And so these are four entirely different divs, and they don't have to be anywhere near this bar of buttons. This is the fourth video in a series of videos about how to code JavaScript events. We will go over some things that were explained in detail in the previous videos, so you might need to refer to those. Just to show you the code that we'll be writing today, the JavaScript code is here. So the function that we're writing is this, and as you see, it is going to use something called dataset, and that goes together with the data attribute. So let's take a quick look at data attributes at the Mozilla Developer Network. So this is their page about using data attributes, and I just want to show you their example for a moment. This is the HTML, not CSS, not JavaScript. This part right here is HTML. And so you initially create a data attribute within your HTML. And they have got three different ones. So I want you to notice how these are different from each other and how they're the same. A data attribute has to begin with data hyphen, or you might think data dash, right? So starts with data dash, right? But then what comes after the dash is up to you. You make this up, you create it. It can be any string that follows normal string conventions. So in their example, they have one data attribute with the name columns. They have another data attribute with the name index hyphen number. And they have a third data attribute with the name parent. So these can be anything. You do what makes sense to you. And then within your HTML, you assign a value to the data attribute that is in that element, right? So they have a data attribute of 3. They have, notice these are strings. They have a data attribute of a 5-digit number. And then they also have a data attribute of the word cars. And so this is the value of each data attribute can be different. If we go to the Can I Use site, we can see that the data attributes have immense support. Every browser, every device, everything supports data attributes. So these are really safe to use and they're really flexible. Okay, so now let's look at the way I am using data attributes in this example. And first we will look at the HTML. The HTML is set up so that there is a div containing 4 buttons. They're not actually button elements, they are span elements, okay, with a class of button. Then below that div containing the 4 buttons, A, B, C, and D, are 4 other divs, and these contain the content. So each of these has a light blue background, and they have different text and a different little emoji inside them. So the data attributes that I have made, I named mine data item. And you will see that I reused that same property name data item in each of my buttons. Data item 4 times. Every button has that same data attribute name, but the value of each data attribute is different. So for the A button, the value is A. For the B button, the value is B, and so on, just like you would expect, right? So this was a simple way to do it. It's up to you. Remember, you get to name the data attribute's property name and its property value. Now, to match these up with their associated content div, I simply reused the same property name and value. So my button for A has the data attribute data item A. My content div for A has data item A. My content div for that is associated with the button B, I just gave it the same data attribute. This is not the only way to use data attributes, but it works really well for this association between a thing that you click or interact with in the HTML and another thing that reacts to that interaction. I'm putting it that way because it doesn't have to be a button that shows and hides a div. It can be a lot of different things, but here we're just doing a simple 4 buttons, 4 divs. The divs show and hide. Whichever button you click shows a particular content, right? But the button to repeat, the important thing, a button is associated with its totally separate div that has content in it by using an identical data item. And that was up to me. That's just how I wrote my code. So that's the HTML. In the JavaScript, we're going to see some things that we saw in previous videos. So I'm not going to go over those. I'm just going to point out what comes from a previous video. So we defined 2 new variables. One is named buttons. One is named boxes. Each of these variables holds what's called a node list. So all of my buttons are contained in this variable buttons. All of my content divs that say, for example, D is for doggy, A is for apple, all the content divs are contained in a node list in the variable boxes. And we also went over this exact function in another video. When you first load the page, all the content divs are hidden. The buttons are visible, but the content divs are hidden. That is done by this function, which is explained in another video. That function is called right here. So when the page loads, that function is called. That function will be called again in our main JavaScript function. Now, the main event is this function. Here is where we are using the data attributes to associate a particular button with a particular content div. So first we have to use for each, and that was covered in another earlier video in this same series. We're going to use an on-click event on each button. That was also covered in another video earlier in this series. When we click any button, A, B, C, or D, we hide all the divs. It's just an easy way to hide all the content without figuring out what's already showing. Just hide it all again. That's the function that we have up above, not part of this function. Then here's where we begin to use the data attribute. I create a new variable within the function. The new variable is named button item. This appears here for the first time. And I assign a value to that variable. The value I assign is the value of the data attribute of the button that was clicked. So let's look at this again. I am writing this function to affect each button in the node list that I made named buttons. I made the node list by saying let buttons equal and then said all the spans that are buttons. When any button is clicked, everything below this will happen. So when you click any button at all from that list, buttons, first all the content divs hide. And then a new variable is created for the first time. This happens each time the function runs. And the variable button item gets assigned to it the value that was in the data attribute in the HTML for that button. That happens with this LEL dot dataset dot item. So the important thing to understand about this little phrase here is that data set, that one word, refers to the data attributes on this page. And so it doesn't say data hyphen here. it says data set. It's a collection. The dot after data set says which data attribute. So if, as in the MDM example, if we had 3 different data attributes on a single element in our HTML, we could access all of them by their different names. So remember that in my HTML, my data attributes are all named data item. To target or access the data attribute named data-item, I use dataset.item within JavaScript. That's how JavaScript gets access to the data attribute that was in the HTML. Now, you may be saying, but where did that L come from? This is covered in an earlier video. It has to do with the JavaScript method for each. For each is covered in another video. But in this case, in this function, we said each of the things that we address with for each, which in this case is the buttons, we're going to call the individual one that was clicked, we're going to call it EL, short for element, right? But we gave it a variable EL. So that is where the EL comes from here. The final set of instructions in this function is another for each right here. So this is a whole bundle here. So what I'm doing now is I'm going to look at the node list of everything that I said boxes. What did I say would be in that node list named boxes? I said all those content divs, the blue divs that appear on the page, they are in the list boxes. So I write a for each for boxes, and I say for every box, go through the list one at a time. It's like a for loop. Go through the boxes one at a time and check if dataset item for that box, the one we're looking at right now, if it is exactly equal to or equivalent to the button item, which is the value of the dataset attribute on the button that was clicked. If it is exactly equal, then show that content element. So I know this is complicated and probably really have to, review the previous videos, but let's take a look at this key function. I've got 2 slides to highlight the most important new information in this video. So first, you want to know how to get the value of a data attribute for an item in your HTML that the user has interacted with. So you're using for each, which was explained in a previous video. That's where the EL comes from. But data set refers to data attributes, and .item refers to the particular name that you gave to a data attribute. The other tricky code is when we've got that button item value, which came from the data attribute value for the button that was clicked, we have to compare that value with the data attribute values of each content element to see which one do we want to stop hiding and show to the user because that button was clicked. So that is a 2-part instruction. And hopefully this can make it clear to you. If you play with it a bit, I think you can make sense of how this works. So the code for this demonstration is available at JS Fiddle, and anybody can use it and copy it, and you can use this bit link to reach that JS Fiddle example.